In this video, we'll look through some of the example artists and tie in some of the design vocabulary words for week 2. These are in Canvas under the week 2 readings and content page, where you'll find 3 prompts to get started thinking about your assignment. The first prompt is to look up the dictionary definition of your theme and think about how it fits into the world right now for you. You'll need to do that on your own since it depends on which theme you pick from the assignment description. We only have time to look at a handful of these example artists, but these are all specifically related to the assignment prompt for week 2. So this should be helpful for you to see what other artists have done when approaching similar challenges to what you're being presented with. The design terms are fundamental art and design vocabulary, but also specific to this digital collage unit. The first artist we'll look at is Helina Metaferia. Her collages give a great example of variety, and that's the use of several elements of design to hold the viewer's attention and guide the eye through the composition. The large face here is the central focal point that then branches out into different combinations of objects and images that are very dense and very complicated. So there's lots of variety here to guide you to different places through the image. We can also see zones of recession, where the background is the part of the composition that appears farthest away from the viewer. The foreground is the part that appears closest to the viewer, and the middle ground is the part in between. Here, the 2 figures are in the foreground of each image, with some patterning in the middle ground, and the background is more of a neutral space. We could also look at Slinger, who makes collages from repetitions of body parts. This is an example of some of the Gestalt principles. In general, Gestalt is this idea that the human brain will attempt to simplify complex images by arranging the parts into an organized whole. Specifically, we could talk about the Gestalt principle of connectedness. When elements share a uniform visual characteristic, they're perceived as being more related than elements with disparate visual characteristics. In this composition, we have an ear inside of a mouth and some weird teeth on the side. These are all visually continuous. The skin tones are very similar, the color palette's very similar, and that's actually in contrast with the fact that we know that these things don't go together. So there's a really interesting tension here between the connectedness visually of these images set against the idea that we know that they don't belong together in the way that they're composed. We could also look at the artist Eugenia Loli for more Gestalt principles. In this one, we could talk about proximity, where visual elements that are close to one another are perceived to be more related than things that are spaced farther apart. So we have a figure without a head, and because this plant in the background is closer to that headless figure than this one on the side, we get this automatic connection that the plant has sort of replaced the head of the figure, and the same thing with the lower part of the figure. We could also see an illustration of the figure-ground relationship. That's this idea that elements are perceived as either figures, which are distinct elements of focus, or ground, which is the background or the landscape on top of which the figures rest. So in this case, we have a literal human figure with some paint smears on top of it. And I would say that it's the paint and the human in this image that are the figures because they stand out from the background. We could also think about another Gestalt principle here, continuation. That's this idea that elements arranged on a line or a curve are more related than elements not on the line or the curve. You can see the waistband and part of the torso of the dancing figure are continuous with the smear of paint. And even those images themselves, they're totally unrelated. It's that lineup, that continuation of the curve, that gives a strong connection between the two. Last but not least, we could look at Kate Sticew's work, and here we can see examples of overlapping. That is simply the placement in a composition of one object in front of another in order to create an illusion of depth. Now, we are getting some depth here, but it's not this kind of logical Renaissance perspective depth. It's a very chaotic depth, and we could use that to talk about another Gestalt principle, which is closure. That's this idea that when looking at a complex arrangement of individual elements, humans tend to first look for a single recognizable pattern. I think here you could say that there's an absence of closure. We're trying to make sense out of this composition, and it just doesn't quite add up. So there's a tension between a lack of closure and all this overlapping, which sort of implies that there's a meaning or a message to it. Okay, so those are just a few touch points for some of this week's example artists and design vocabulary. Please take some time and go through and make sure you read all the vocab, as well as going through and looking at some of the artist examples that we didn't get a chance to look at here. I promise they'll be interesting, helpful, and inspiring for your work this week.